Every woman in that churchyard wept. The widow from the village dabbed her eyes with a gray handkerchief. The rector's wife pressed her lips together and looked at the sky. Even the young housemaids, girls who had never once spoken to Sir Edmund Ashworth, stood with red-rimmed eyes and trembling chins. But not Evelyn. Evelyn Ashworth stood at the edge of her father's grave in a black dress that was slightly too large, let out at the seams the night before, because grief had not left much time for a proper fitting, and she did not cry. Her hands were folded. Her chin was level. Her eyes were dry and very still. People noticed. Of course they noticed. She was the dead man's only daughter. She was supposed to be inconsolable. She was supposed to need steadying, supposed to lean on someone's arm, supposed to press a handkerchief to her mouth and let the sound escape whether she wished it to or not. She did none of those things. And the whispers had already begun. Poor composure, strange girl, always was a little cold, when James Calloway, the Duke of Marath, cleared his throat. He was standing 3 feet from the grave. He had come to the funeral, people said, out of respect, out of old family loyalty, out of decency. What he said next had nothing to do with decency. "Before we part," he said, in that voice that carried without effort, the voice of a man who had never once needed to raise it, "I wish to share news that I hope will bring some brightness to a sorrowful day." Evelyn looked at him then, just once, directly, and her expression did not change. "Miss Cecily Hargrove has done me the very great honor of accepting my proposal of marriage." The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then the churchyard erupted, gasps, murmurs, a dropped prayer book, someone's sharp intake of breath that was almost a laugh and quickly smothered. Every head turned, half toward James, standing tall and untouched by the noise around him, half toward Evelyn, standing equally still at the grave's edge, hands folded, chin level, eyes dry. She was the only one who did not cry, not because she felt nothing, because she already knew. The mourning had started badly, as mournings tend to do when a father is being buried. Evelyn had woken before dawn, not from grief exactly, though grief was there, sitting heavy and unhelpful at the back of her throat, but from the particular anxiety of someone who has too much to manage and no one to help her manage it. The household accounts needed settling. The solicitor was coming Thursday. The rector had asked twice about the reading, and she had forgotten to confirm, and there was the matter of the flowers, which had arrived half-wilted because the order had been placed in the wrong village entirely. Her mother had been dead 11 years. There was no one else. So Evelyn had risen at 5, dressed herself, arranged everything that could be arranged, and arrived at St. Bride's churchyard with 10 minutes to spare and the specific, hollow composure of a woman who has been too busy to collapse. She had expected the stairs. She was Sir Edmund Ashworth's daughter, the plain one, some people said, though they generally waited until they thought she couldn't hear. She had expected the sympathy, the pressed hands, the voices dropping half an octave to deliver their condolences like parcels too fragile to put down quickly. She had expected all of that. She had not expected James. Or rather, she had expected him, because he had always come when protocol demanded it, always appeared at the correct moment with the correct expression. She had simply, foolishly, allowed herself to believe that this time it would be different, that he would come not because protocol demanded it, but because something else did, because of the 11 years she had known him, because of the letters, because of the evening last October in the library at Houseworth, when the fire had burned low, and he had looked at her in a way that she had spent 4 months trying to explain away and could not. He had arrived late, which was unlike him. He had stood slightly apart from the other mourners, which was not. His face, when she allowed herself one careful glance, was composed and unreadable in the manner she had come to know very well, the manner that meant he was performing composure rather than feeling it. She had thought, stupidly, "He came for me." She understood 2 hours later that he had come for the audience. The announcement landed in the churchyard like something dropped from a height. Evelyn heard the words Cecily Hargrove, great honor, proposal, marriage, and something happened in her chest that she could not have named precisely. Not surprise. Not quite. It was more like the specific sensation of a thing you have been bracing for finally arriving, the relief of impact after too long spent waiting for it. She had braced for this. She had told herself to brace for this. She had lain awake in the weeks after October and constructed careful arguments about why nothing had been promised, why a look in a library was not a declaration, why a man like James Calloway, heir to one of the oldest dukedoms in England, owner of 3 estates, burdened with the specific obligations of his name and his blood, would never in any sensible world choose a woman with no fortune and a father currently drowning in debt. She had been very thorough about it. And yet, she stood at the grave's edge and felt the assembled churchyard waiting for her to break. She could feel it as clearly as she could feel the cold March air on the back of her neck, that collective held breath, that terrible hunger for a reaction. They wanted tears. They wanted her hand pressed to her mouth. They wanted the satisfaction of a scene. She gave them nothing. Not because she was cold. Not because she didn't feel it. She felt it with a completeness that would have frightened her if she had let herself look directly at it. But she had been managing impossible things since 5 o'clock that morning, and she could manage this too. She would cry later, alone in the room at the end of the east corridor where no one ever came. She would sit on the floor if she needed to and let it be as bad as it was going to be. Not here. Not for them. Not for him. The mourners dispersed slowly, the way people do when something more interesting than a funeral has occurred, and they are not quite ready to stop discussing it. Evelyn accepted condolences with a steady hand and a steady voice, and thanked people for coming with a precision that felt, by the end, almost mechanical. James did not approach her. He stood at the far edge of the path, speaking to the rector, and then to old Lord Pemberton, and then to someone whose name Evelyn couldn't place, and every time she glanced toward him, which she did only rarely and only because it was unavoidable, he was looking very deliberately somewhere else. This told her everything she needed to know. A man who had done something careless by accident would have come to her, would have fumbled an explanation, would have said I meant to tell you or I am sorry for the timing or anything at all. Any of the clumsy, insufficient things people say when they have caused pain without intending to. He said nothing. He did not come to her. He left before the last of the mourners, with a brief nod in her direction from 20 feet away. The kind of nod you give an acquaintance, a neighbor, someone you know only slightly and have no particular reason to address. Evelyn nodded back. She kept her hands folded, her chin level, her eyes dry and very still. It was only when the last carriage had rolled down the lane, and the churchyard was finally, mercifully empty, that she turned back to her father's grave and stood there for a long moment in the cold. He knew, she thought. Before he came here today, he already knew, and he came anyway. Not to speak to her, not to explain, not to ask forgiveness for the silence of the last 3 months. He had come here to make an announcement in a churchyard, over her father's fresh grave, in front of everyone who had ever known her name. And she still did not cry. But her hands, beneath the black gloves, were pressed so tightly together that the knuckles had gone quite white. There was, she thought, a letter waiting at home. Her father had left it on his writing desk with her name on the front in his familiar unsteady hand. She had not opened it yet. She had been too busy. There had always been one more thing to arrange. Tonight, she decided, she would read it. She had a feeling it was going to change things. She was right, but not in any way she could have anticipated standing there in the cold March churchyard, with the smell of turned earth and cut grass around her, and the sound of the last carriage long since faded down the lane. Not in any way at all. The story that circulated through the county, through drawing rooms and morning calls, and the particular kind of careful conversation that happens over tea when someone wants to say something unkind, and is looking for the most respectable way to do it, was simple enough. Sir Edmund Ashworth had died in debt. His daughter had no fortune, no connections worth speaking of, and no particular beauty to compensate for either. The Duke of Marath had been neighborly, nothing more. Whatever people had imagined between them had been exactly that. Imagination, the wishful thinking of a county with too little to occupy itself. Cecily Hargrove, on the other hand, had £40,000 and a father who sat in Parliament. The match made perfect sense. The story was tidy and it was logical, and almost everyone believed it. Almost everyone was wrong. Evelyn had known James Calloway for 11 years. Not in the way debutantes knew dukes, across ballrooms, through introductions, in the careful choreography of social occasions where every word was measured, and every glance assigned a meaning it may or may not have deserved. She had known him the way you know someone when your families share a boundary wall and a long history, and a habit of turning up in the same places without particularly planning to. She had been 17 when his father died, and James had inherited the dukedom at 22, arriving back from the continent with less ceremony than people expected and considerably more gravity. She remembered thinking he looked like a man who had been handed something very heavy and was deciding whether to put it down or learn to carry it. He had learned to carry it. He carried everything that way, quietly, without complaint, without asking anyone whether it was fair. She had respected that about him before she had felt anything else about him. The friendship, if that was the right word, and Evelyn had spent considerable time questioning whether it was, had grown slowly and without announcement. He had a habit of appearing in the Ashworth Library when he came to visit her father, and her father had a habit of being called away to attend to something urgent, and for some years Evelyn had suspected this was not coincidental. James would remain. They would talk. Not the careful, managed conversation of acquaintances finding common ground, but the kind that moved quickly and covered distance, books, ideas, the particular absurdities of the society they both moved through, the things that frustrated them, the things that didn't. He listened to her in a way that she had not before him understood was unusual. Most men of his position listened to women the way they listened to weather reports, politely, briefly, with the general intention of going about their plans regardless. James listened as though what she said might actually change his mind. Sometimes it did. He told her so when it happened, which was more disarming than anything else he could have done. She had not meant to feel what she eventually felt. It had arrived the way inconvenient things often do, gradually, and then all at once. And by the time she recognized it clearly, it had already made itself entirely at home. She had never said it. Of course she hadn't. A woman in her position with her prospects did not say such things to a duke. The risk was not simply embarrassment, it was ruin. A misplaced declaration, a misread situation, and she would become a story told in drawing rooms, a cautionary example of a girl who had mistaken courtesy for something warmer and made a fool of herself in the process. So she had said nothing, and he had said nothing, and for years they had existed in the careful space between those two silences. And then came October. The evening at Houseworth had not been planned as anything significant. A small gathering, 8 or 10 people, supper, the kind of relaxed autumn evening that happens at the end of the season when everyone is slightly tired of being on their best behavior. Evelyn had been seated next to James at supper, which was not unusual. They had talked throughout the meal, which was not unusual either. What happened afterward was not unusual in itself. The party had moved to the library. The fire had burned low. People had drifted in pairs and small groups toward different corners of the room, and Evelyn and James had ended up, quite naturally, without navigation, the way things happen when two people have spent years gravitating toward each other without acknowledging it, standing together near the window. He had been telling her something about the East Field at Marath, a drainage problem, tedious in description and somehow not tedious at all in the telling, because he was frustrated about it. and frustration made him talk faster and drop the careful ducal manner he wore in company. She had been listening and watching the way the firelight moved, and there had been a pause, the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't require filling, and he had looked at her. Not the ordinary social glance of a man checking whether his companion was still engaged. Something else. Something longer and more deliberate, and complicated in a way she could not precisely catalog, and when she met it he did not look away. Neither did she. It had lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It had lasted, she thought later, considerably longer than that in whatever part of the mind stores things it cannot explain. He had said, very quietly, "Evelyn." Just her name, nothing attached to it. No question, no declaration, simply her name in his voice with something underneath it that she had been turning over ever since, trying to determine whether it was what it sounded like, or whether she had, like everyone in that county, simply wanted something to be true and invented the evidence. A week later her father had taken ill. 3 weeks after that her father was dead. And James Calloway had stood over the grave and announced his engagement to Cecily Hargrove. What everyone believed was that Evelyn had been foolish, that she had read too much into a neighborly friendship, that the Duke had always been perfectly clear and perfectly correct, and that any suffering on her part was the result of her own imagination. What Evelyn believed, as she walked home from the funeral in the thin March cold, was considerably more specific. She believed James had known exactly what that evening in the library had been. She believed he had made his choice anyway. And she believed, though she could not yet explain why, that he had made it for reasons that had nothing to do with Cecily Hargrove's £40,000. She believed this because of the way he had not looked at her in the churchyard, not the ordinary avoidance of a man who has caused accidental pain and is embarrassed by it. Something more careful than that. Something that looked, to someone who had watched him closely for 11 years, like a man keeping a very deliberate distance, as though proximity were dangerous, as though he did not trust himself to be near her. She had been turning that over since the churchyard. She was still turning it when she arrived home, when she took off her black gloves, when she sat down at the writing desk in the small study off the hall, when she picked up her father's letter. The envelope was heavier than she expected. Her name was written on the front in her father's hand, the hand of a man who had been ill for weeks before he died, slightly unsteady, slightly too large, pressing harder than necessary as though he wanted to be sure it would last. She held it for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up. The house was very quiet. She broke the seal. She read it once quickly, the way you read something when you are bracing for impact, taking in the shape of it before the meaning. Then she put it down. Then she picked it up and read it again, slowly this time, her eyes moving over each line with the particular attention of someone who suspects they have misunderstood and very much hopes they have not. She had not misunderstood. Her father's handwriting blurred slightly at the edges, not from tears, not yet, but from the effort of keeping her breathing even, and she set the letter on the desk and pressed both palms flat against the surface and looked at the wall for a long moment. James had come to her father 6 weeks ago while her father was still well enough to receive visitors. He had come with an offer not of marriage but of money, enough to clear the debts, enough to keep the house, enough, her father had written, to give Evelyn a proper future with or without him. The condition was this, that Sir Edmund release Evelyn from any expectation, that he make it understood to Evelyn, to the county, to anyone who might be watching, that there was nothing between her and the Duke of Marath and never had been, that she be free to pursue another match, unencumbered by a connection that could only, James had apparently said, hold her back. Her father had refused the money. He had kept the letter. She read the last lines again. I did not tell you because I did not know what it meant, and I did not want to give you something to hope for that might not be hope at all. I still don't know what it means, Evelyn, but I thought you should have the truth. You always did manage the truth better than I did. The choice of what to do with it is yours. She folded the letter. She sat with it in her hands for a very long time. Outside the window, the March wind moved through the bare trees, and the house settled around her in the particular silence of a place that has just lost its last familiar inhabitant. And Evelyn Ashworth sat at her father's desk and thought. Not about what she felt. She would allow herself to feel it later when there was time and privacy and a floor she could sit on if she needed to. She thought about what it meant. A man who wanted to be free of her did not pay off her father's debts. A man who had chosen Cecily Hargrove for £40,000 did not offer £40,000 to be refused. He had tried to give her a future. He had simply, catastrophically, not asked her whether it was the future she wanted. She set the letter down. She pressed her hands flat on the desk again. And for the first time since the churchyard, something shifted in her chest, not grief, not anger, not the hollow relief of impact. Something that felt, cautiously and against her better judgment, like the first edge of understanding. There was a box under Evelyn's bed. It was not a remarkable box, plain wood, no carving, the kind of thing that might hold old correspondence or household receipts or any of the dozen categories of paper that accumulate in a life and have no better place to go. Her mother had used it for recipes. Evelyn had repurposed it at 18 for something she had never told anyone about. Letters, not sent letters, not received ones. Letters she had written to James Calloway over the course of 11 years and never once put in an envelope. She was not proud of this. She was also not particularly ashamed of it. It had begun as a practical exercise, a way of saying things she could not say aloud, and had continued because it helped, and because it harmed no one, and because the box was under the bed and not, crucially, in anyone else's possession. She had written them when something happened that she wished she could tell him, when she was frustrated or delighted or had read something she knew he would argue with. When the gap between what she felt and what she was permitted to say had become briefly unmanageable. She had never counted them. She did not want to know how many there were. She found the box at 9:30 that evening, having spent the intervening hours doing what she always did when she did not know what else to do, being useful. She had sorted her father's papers into 3 categories. She had written to the solicitor. She had eaten a meal she did not taste. She had spoken to Mrs. Beale about the household for the following week, and to the groom about the horses, and to no one about anything that actually mattered because there was no one to speak to. Then she had gone upstairs, and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a moment, and then reached underneath it and pulled out the box. She did not open it immediately. She held it in her lap and thought about what her father had written. The choice of what to do with it is yours. She had been thinking about it all evening, thinking about James standing in that churchyard with his announcement and his careful distance and his expression that gave away nothing, thinking about the money he had offered and the condition he had attached to it, and the specific, baffling logic of a man who believed that removing himself from her life was a form of generosity. She had also been thinking, she could not help it, about what Cecily Hargrove was doing tonight, whether she was happy, whether she had any idea what she had agreed to. She opened the box. The letters were in no particular order. She had never organized them, had simply placed each one on top of the last, which meant the most recent ones were uppermost. She lifted the first few and set them aside. Then she stopped. The letter on top of the older stack was dated October, 3 days after Halsworth. She did not remember writing it. She remembered the night, remembered sitting at the small desk by the window with the feeling of that library still somewhere in her chest, unresolved and persistent. She must have written it then. She picked it up. James. I am going to tell you something I would never say aloud, because saying it aloud would require a courage I don't have, and writing it here costs me nothing except honesty, which I find I can manage in private better than most places. I think you know what happened this evening. I think you felt it as clearly as I did. I think you have felt it for some time, possibly longer than I have, And I think that is why you said my name the way you said it, not as a question, not as a greeting, but as though you were testing whether it was still safe to say. I don't know what you're afraid of. I know you're afraid of something. I have watched you carry difficult things quietly for 11 years, and I recognize the particular way you hold yourself when you have decided to bear something alone. I want to tell you that you don't have to. I want to tell you that whatever it is, the title, the expectations, my father's situation, whatever calculation you are making in that very thorough way you make calculations, I would rather know the truth of it than spend another year pretending that what exists between us is simple neighborliness. But I won't send this. You know I won't. So I will fold it and put it away and see you next time and talk about drainage or parliament or whatever the occasion requires, and we will both be very sensible, and perhaps that is the right thing. I hope you know, even without this letter, that I am not afraid of the truth. I hope you know that you could tell me. She read it twice. Then she folded it along its original crease and held it in both hands and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not sadness exactly, though sadness was present. Something more like recognition. The recognition of a woman who had been right about something important and had talked herself out of trusting it. She had known. She had written it down, 3 days after Houseworth, in the privacy of her own room. I think you felt it as clearly as I did, and then she had folded it away and told herself to be sensible. And then her father had died, and James had stood at the grave and announced his engagement, and she had stood very still with her hands pressed together and thought she had been wrong about everything. But the letter from her father said otherwise. And the letter in her hands, her own words, written before any of it, said otherwise too. She put October's letter aside and went further back into the box, not searching for anything specific, simply moving through time the way you move through a house you grew up in, recognizing things, placing them, understanding them differently than you did when they were new. There was a letter from 4 years ago about a conversation they'd had over a disagreement about one of Walter Scott's novels. She had been right, and he had eventually admitted it, which had taken him 3 weeks and had given her more satisfaction than she felt entirely dignified about. There was one from 2 winters ago when the snow had cut off the road between Marath and Ashworth for 6 days, and she had written to him every evening in her head and committed one of those evenings to paper, just to have somewhere to put it. There was one from the year his mother had been ill, when she had watched him from across a supper table looking very tired and very alone in the specific way of people surrounded by company, and she had written, she had forgotten this entirely. I think the thing I most want, for you, is for someone to take the weight of it sometimes. I don't think anyone does. I would if you let me. But you won't ask and I won't offer, and so we will continue as we are, which is better than nothing and not as good as it should be. She sat with that one for a long time, better than nothing and not as good as it should be. She had been writing the truth in this box for 11 years, had been perfectly capable of clarity and directness, and honest assessment when the only audience was herself, had known exactly what she felt and what she observed and what was actually happening between them, and had folded it away every time because the risk was too large and the world was not organized in her favor, and being sensible was, in the end, what was required of her. James, apparently, had been doing something similar, making private calculations, deciding things on her behalf, trying to help her in ways that required him to absent himself from the equation entirely. 2 people, she thought, being extremely sensible in completely opposite directions. The absurdity of it was so complete that she almost laughed. Almost. She put the letters back in the box, carefully, in the same order she had found them, and slid it back under the bed. She went to the window. Outside, Marath's lights were visible across the fields, the upper windows lit, one lamp moving slowly behind the glass as though someone was walking through the house. She watched it for a moment. Then she went to her writing desk. She took out a fresh sheet of paper, uncapped the ink, and picked up the pen. She thought for a long time before she wrote anything. Then she wrote, James. She stopped, read his name in her own handwriting, put the pen down, picked it up again. There are things I should have said to you some time ago. I did not say them because I was being sensible, which I have since concluded was a significant error on both our parts. My father left me a letter. I think you know what was in it. I am not writing this to accuse you of anything. I am writing it because I have spent 11 years saying the right things and putting the true things in a box under my bed, and I find I am no longer entirely willing to do that. I have questions, not accusations, questions. If you are the man I believe you to be, you will answer them honestly. If you are not, I would rather know that too. She read it back. Then she did something she had never done in 11 years of letter writing. She folded it, she addressed the envelope. She carried it downstairs and placed it on the hall table where Mrs. Beale would find it in the morning and send it with the rest of the post. She went back upstairs. She lay down on her bed without undressing. She stared at the ceiling and thought, well, that is done. For the first time since that morning, since the churchyard and the announcement and the white-knuckled hands inside the black gloves, something in her chest was quiet. Not resolved, not healed, not anything so simple as that. But quiet in the way of a person who has finally, after a very long time, done the thing they should have done first. She closed her eyes. Outside, across the fields, the lamp in Marath's upper window continued its slow movement through the house. She did not see it stop. She did not see it stop for a very long time. Cecily Hargrove arrived on a Tuesday. Evelyn had not expected her. There had been no card, no note, no advance warning of any kind, simply a knock at the front door at 10:30 in the morning, and Mrs. Beale appearing in the doorway of the study, with an expression that managed to be both carefully neutral and extremely communicative. Miss Hargrove, ma'am, she says she won't keep you long. Evelyn set down her pen. She had been working through her father's accounts, a task that was proving to be considerably worse than she had anticipated, which was saying something, because she had anticipated it being quite bad. The numbers were not improving with examination. She had been sitting with them for 2 hours and her back ached, and her eyes were tired, and she was not, by any measure, in the best condition to receive the woman currently engaged to James Calloway. "Show her in," she said, "and bring tea, please." Cecily Hargrove was prettier than Evelyn had expected, which she acknowledged was an uncharitable way to begin an assessment of another person. She was perhaps 22, with fair hair dressed very neatly and a traveling coat that was expensive without being ostentatious, the clothes of someone who had been taught that good taste meant restraint. She was also, Evelyn noticed immediately, extremely nervous. She came into the study with her hands clasped in front of her, and her eyes moving quickly around the room. Not nosily, not with the acquisitive assessment of someone cataloging another woman's possessions, but with the specific alertness of someone who was not entirely sure they had made the right decision in coming, and was looking for confirmation either way. "Miss Ashworth," her voice was steady, "points to her for that," Evelyn thought. "Thank you for seeing me. I know the timing is," she stopped. "I'm sorry, I had a speech prepared and I appear to have lost it." "Please sit down," Evelyn said. Cecily sat. Evelyn sat across from her. They regarded each other for a moment with the particular mutual wariness of two people who have been placed in an impossible situation by the actions of a third party who is not present to answer for it. Mrs. Beale brought tea. Neither of them touched it. "I want to say," Cecily began, "that I am very sorry about your father, truly. The timing of the announcement was," she pressed her lips together briefly. "It was not my choice." "I didn't imagine it was," Evelyn said. Something in Cecily's expression shifted, a small release, as though she had been holding her breath and had now, cautiously, let some of it go. "No, I suppose you didn't." She looked at her hands. "I want to be honest with you, Miss Ashworth, because I think the alternative is worse. I am not good at pretending things are other than they are. My mother says it is my most significant social failing. I find it rather refreshing, Evelyn said. Cecily looked up. A brief, unguarded smile, the first natural expression she had shown since entering the room. It made her considerably more likable. The thing is, Cecily said, I know what people are saying, about you and the Duke, about what this must look like from where you're standing. She paused. I want you to know that I am not your enemy in this. I'm not sure I'm anyone's enemy, actually. I'm not very good at that either. Evelyn studied her. There was something earnest in Cecily's manner that was difficult to dismiss, a quality of directness that sat oddly with the careful presentation, as though the expensive coat and the neat hair belonged to one person and the words belonged to quite another. Why did you come? Evelyn asked. Not unkindly, simply directly. Cecily was quiet for a moment. Because I think you deserve to hear something from someone who is actually in the room, she said, rather than through county gossip, which I understand to be a somewhat unreliable channel. What Cecily said next, Evelyn would turn over many times in the days that followed. She said it plainly, without drama, in the manner of someone delivering information they believe the other person has a right to. She kept her hands folded in her lap and her eyes steady, and she did not, Evelyn noticed, apologize for any of it, which suggested she understood that it was not, at its root, her fault. Her family was in difficulty, not the polite, manageable difficulty of a reduced income or an overspent season, real difficulty, the kind that arrived quietly and then all at once, the way her father's debts had apparently done. Her father's investments had failed 18 months ago. The estate was mortgaged. The creditors were patient but only just. She had 2 younger sisters. The match with James had been arranged between their fathers. Not Cecily's preference, she said, looking at the window rather than at Evelyn when she said it, not precisely forced, but not chosen either. The kind of arrangement that presents itself as inevitable and relies on everyone agreeing not to examine it too closely. I don't dislike him, she said carefully. He has been perfectly correct. Perfectly, she searched for the word. Considerate. He is very good at being considerate. Yes, Evelyn said, he is. They both understood what was not being said. A man could be considerate and correct and perfectly proper and still be entirely, thoroughly elsewhere. A man could do everything right and look at his fiancée the way you look at a responsibility, with care, with good intentions, with the specific warmth of someone who has decided to do their duty properly and means to keep that decision. It was not nothing, but it was not everything. I know about you, Cecily said quietly, not from gossip, from I notice things, the way he speaks when your name comes up, or doesn't speak, rather. She looked back at Evelyn directly. There is a difference between a man who has forgotten someone and a man who is being very careful not to remember them too loudly. The accuracy of this observation, delivered in Cecily Hargrove's composed and slightly sorrowful voice, hit Evelyn somewhere she had not expected. She picked up her tea, set it down without drinking it. What is it you want from me? She asked, specifically. Cecily was quiet for long enough that Evelyn thought she might not answer. Then I came because I wanted to see you. I wanted to understand. A pause. And I suppose I wanted to know whether you were going to fight for it, because if you are, you should know that another pause longer. I would not stand in the way of something real. I am practical enough to understand the difference between a financial arrangement and a marriage, and principled enough, I hope, to know which one I'd rather have. The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the bare garden. Inside, 2 women sat across from each other in a dead man's study and said, with some difficulty, the things that the situation actually required. Evelyn thought about her box of letters. She thought about 11 years of folding the true things away and saying the sensible things instead. She thought about her father's letter, about the offer James had made, and the condition he had attached to it, and the particular, maddening logic of a man who had decided what was best for everyone without consulting anyone. She thought about the letter she had finally sent, the one sitting now in Marath's postal tray, or perhaps already opened, or perhaps not yet arrived. She didn't know. She didn't know what James would do with it. She didn't know if it would change anything or simply be the latest in a long series of almost moments that went nowhere. She looked at Cecily Hargrove, sitting across from her with her hands folded, and her nervous precision, and her two younger sisters, and her honest, inconvenient integrity. She felt something she had not anticipated feeling. She felt sorry for her. Not the pitying sort of sorry, not the sorry that condescends. The genuine kind. The kind that recognizes something of yourself in another person's situation and understands that they did not choose it any more than you chose yours. "You said you came to understand," Evelyn said. "What did you find?" Cecily considered this. "I found," she said slowly, "that the county gossip is wrong in most of the interesting ways." She looked at Evelyn steadily. "You are not cold. You are not strange. You are someone who has been managing a great deal for a long time with very little assistance." A brief pause. "And you are someone that a very foolish duke spent 3 months trying to give up, apparently without any success whatsoever." Evelyn said nothing, but something in her face must have moved because Cecily's expression softened. "I think," Cecily said carefully, "that you should go to the ball." Evelyn looked at her. "The Pemberton ball," Cecily said. "Next Friday. I know you weren't planning to attend. I know it would be, I know people would talk." A small pause. "People are already talking. I find that once that ship has sailed, there is very little to be gained by staying home." "You would be there," Evelyn said, "with him." "Yes," Cecily held her gaze. "I would be there, as his fiancée, and you would be there as," she paused, "as someone who has every right to attend a ball and has done nothing wrong." She stood, smoothed her coat, picked up her gloves from the arm of the chair. "I have been perfectly honest with you," she said at the door. "More honest, probably, than I intended to be when I arrived. I hope you will. I hope it's useful." "It is," Evelyn said. She meant it. Cecily nodded, moved to leave. "Miss Hargrove," she turned. "For what it's worth," Evelyn said quietly, "you deserve better than a financial arrangement." Cecily was still for a moment. "So do you," she said, and left. Evelyn sat alone in her father's study for a long time after the sound of hooves had faded down the lane. The accounts were still on the desk in front of her. The numbers were still bad. The solicitor was still coming Thursday, and the house was still mortgaged to a degree she had not yet fully calculated, and her father was still dead, and there was still an enormous amount of entirely practical, urgent, unglamorous work to be done before she could afford to think about anything else. She looked at the accounts. She looked at the door through which Cecily Hargrove had just walked. She thought about the ball. She thought about James, who had paid a great deal of money to free her from an expectation she had not asked to be freed from, and who had announced his engagement at her father's funeral, and who, according to Cecily, spoke her name with a particular kind of careful silence. She thought he made every decision, every single one. He decided what I needed. He decided what was best. He decided when to act and when to withdraw and when to protect me and how and from what without once asking. She pulled the accounts toward her. She picked up her pen. Friday, she thought, the Pemberton ball. She would need the dark burgundy dress. The one that was not quite mourning and not quite ordinary and occupied, like Evelyn herself at this particular moment, a category that was difficult to place and not entirely comfortable to ignore. She would go, not to fight exactly, not with that word. But she had spent 11 years folding herself away into a box under the bed, and she had sent one honest letter, and a woman she had met for the first time 40 minutes ago had looked her in the eye and told her she deserved better than an arrangement. She was inclined, for once, to agree. The Pemberton ball was, by any measure, the social event of the early spring season. Lord and Lady Pemberton hosted it every year in the first weeks after the worst of the cold had passed, a tradition that had outlasted 3 monarchs, 2 significant renovations to the house, and at least one scandal that people still referenced obliquely when they thought no one younger was listening. The ballroom at Pemberton Hall held 200 people comfortably, and had held considerably more on occasions when comfort was considered secondary to spectacle. The chandeliers were original. The floors were famous. The supper was always excellent and always discussed at length, which Lady Pemberton considered a greater compliment than anything said about the dancing. This year, for the first time in living memory, the supper was not the most discussed thing in the room. Evelyn arrived late. Not dramatically late, not the entrance of someone who has calculated the effect and timed their arrival accordingly. Simply late in the practical way of a woman who had spent the afternoon with a solicitor receiving news that was worse than expected, had driven home to find that the kitchen fire had gone out, and Mrs. Beale was managing a minor crisis with the upstairs plumbing, and had dressed in 40 minutes with her hair done by her own hands because there was no one else. The result was, she thought, acceptable. The burgundy dress fit correctly. Her hair was simple and neat, and she had stopped apologizing for simple and neat sometime around the age of 25. She wore her mother's earrings, which were the best thing she owned and which she saved for occasions that warranted them. She had decided, getting into the carriage, that this warranted them. She gave her name at the door, walked through the entrance hall, paused at the top of the 3 steps that led down into the ballroom. The room was very full and very bright, and very loud with the particular noise of 200 people who have been given champagne, and something interesting to discuss. She understood, within approximately 4 seconds of standing at the top of those steps, that she was the interesting thing. The whispers moved through the room the way ripples move across water, outward from the point of disturbance, reaching the far edges before the center had quite settled. She saw heads turn, saw fans raised and lowered, saw the specific choreography of people who want to look at something and are trying to appear as though they are not. She kept her chin level. She walked down the 3 steps at a normal pace. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing footman and took a small, steadying sip. There, she thought, that is done. Lady Pemberton found her within minutes. Bless the woman, Evelyn thought, for being exactly the sort of hostess who moves toward rather than away from complicated situations. My dear, Lady Pemberton took both her hands, pressed them warmly, said nothing about the funeral, nothing about the announcement, nothing about the whispers that were still moving through the room behind Evelyn's back. Simply, I am very glad you came. Come and sit with me for a moment. Evelyn went gratefully. She did not look for James immediately. She was aware of him. She was always aware of him in rooms, had been for years, the way you develop a peripheral sense for someone you have spent a long time trying not to watch too obviously. She knew, without looking directly, that he was somewhere to her left, toward the far end of the room near the windows. She knew he had seen her. She knew this because the quality of not looking in that direction had changed the moment she entered, had become, very slightly, more deliberate. She talked to Lady Pemberton. She talked to old Colonel Fairfax, who was deaf in one ear and hadn't heard about the funeral announcement, and therefore treated her with the cheerful normalcy of someone who had no idea anything was amiss, which was the most relaxing conversation she had had in a week. She talked to the Mrs. Lowther, who were kind girls and very young and clearly burning with questions they were too well bred to ask. She did not talk to James. She was aware, as the first hour passed, that he was aware of this. She saw Cecily before she saw James properly. Cecily was standing near the middle of the room in a pale green dress that suited her extremely well, talking to a woman Evelyn didn't recognize with the polite attention of someone whose mind is partially elsewhere. When she caught Evelyn's eye across the room, something in her expression did 2 things simultaneously: relief, and something more complicated that Evelyn couldn't fully read. She gave a small, nearly imperceptible nod. Evelyn returned it. There was an entire conversation in those 4 seconds that neither of them could have put into words, and both of them understood completely. James found her at the edge of the room near the second set of windows, during the pause between dances, when the noise dropped by half and the air moved through the briefly opened doors, and the room reorganized itself for the next set. She heard him before she saw him, that particular quality of his footstep, which she had apparently memorized without intending to and recognized now with an accuracy that she found mildly embarrassing. She turned. He was closer than she expected. He had crossed the room quickly, she thought, not the measured approach of a man paying a social call, but the movement of someone who had made a decision and was acting on it before the decision could be reconsidered. He looked, she thought, tired. Not the ordinary tiredness of a late evening, but something older than that, the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something heavy and quietly for long enough that it has begun to show. Good, she thought, and was immediately ashamed of thinking it. Evelyn, his voice was low. The room around them was noisy enough that no one nearby could have heard. I didn't expect. I know you didn't, she said, a pause. He looked at her steadily. She looked back with the same steadiness. She had been practicing it for 11 years, this particular quality of meeting his gaze without giving anything away, and she was, by now, quite accomplished at it. Your letter arrived this morning, he said. I thought it might. He stopped, started again. I have been trying to think of how to answer it. You could simply answer it, she said. That generally works. Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, the particular flicker of someone who is in a difficult situation and has just been reminded, briefly, of why the difficult situation exists in the first place. This isn't, he glanced around them. The room was beginning to reform for the next dance. This is not the right place. No, Evelyn agreed. It isn't, she waited. He said nothing further. She could see him calculating, measuring the room, the eyes, the distance between what he wanted to say and what the situation permitted. The same calculation she had watched him make 100 times. The same careful management of circumstance that had brought them, with extraordinary efficiency, to exactly where they currently stood. Something, she decided, was going to have to change. Your Grace, she said, quietly, correctly, with a precision that was its own kind of message. Thank you for attending my father's funeral. She turned away. She heard rather than saw the effect of this. Not a scene, she had not intended a scene and had not made one. Simply a woman concluding a conversation and moving away. But James Calloway was not a man accustomed to being turned away from, and the room, despite its noise and its movement and its 100 other preoccupations, had a way of noticing when something real happened within it. She walked to the other side of the room. She kept her chin level. She accepted another glass of champagne. She talked to someone about something she would not later remember. She did not allow herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened until she was outside, briefly, on the small terrace off the east corridor, where the cold air was sharp, and the noise of the ballroom was muffled, and she could breathe without anyone watching her do it. She stood there for perhaps 3 minutes. She was thinking about James's face when she had turned away. The precise expression on it, not anger, not wounded pride, something more unguarded than that. Something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, like a man watching something he valued moving away from him and understanding, for the first time, that it might not come back. She hoped she was reading it correctly. She hoped. Miss Ashworth, she turned sharply. It was not James. It was Cecily, slipping through the terrace door with her pale green skirts and her careful expression, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. She pulled the door closed behind her and stood for a moment, and something about the set of her face made the hairs on Evelyn's arms rise beneath her sleeves. I need to tell you something, Cecily said. I should have told you on Tuesday. I thought I could. I told myself it wasn't my place. She stopped, pressed her lips together briefly. "But I've been watching you this evening, and I think if I don't say it, I will regret it considerably." Evelyn set down her champagne on the stone balustrade. "Tell me," she said. Cecily was quiet for a moment. The ballroom noise pressed softly against the doors behind her. In the garden below them, the first spring bulbs were pushing through the dark earth, pale and determined. "The reason James agreed to this arrangement," Cecily said, "was not my father's money." Evelyn went very still. "My father has connections in Parliament," Cecily continued. "There was a serious matter involving your father's name, documents, a business association from some years ago that could have been made to look very damaging." She met Evelyn's eyes directly. "My father had access to those documents. He offered to make them disappear. The price was this engagement." The cold air seemed to get colder. "James agreed," Cecily said, "because the alternative was a scandal that would have destroyed your father's name and followed you for the rest of your life." A pause. "He agreed before your father died. He thought he was protecting you." Another pause, smaller. "He thought you would never need to know." The silence between them was very complete. Evelyn heard the music start up again inside the ballroom. A waltz, bright and uncomplicated, entirely indifferent to what was happening on the terrace. "He traded himself," she said. Her voice came out very level, which surprised her. "To protect my father's reputation." "Yes." "Without telling me." "Yes." Evelyn turned and looked at the garden. The dark shapes of the hedges, the pale bulbs in the cold earth, the sky above the trees that was the dense blue-black of a clear spring night. She thought about James's face in the churchyard, that careful distance, not the avoidance of a man who had chosen carelessly and was embarrassed, the avoidance of a man maintaining a position he had decided was necessary and was finding, possibly, harder to maintain than he had anticipated. She thought about her letter. "I have questions." Not accusations, questions. She thought about his voice 20 minutes ago in the ballroom. "I have been trying to think of how to answer it." She turned back to Cecily. "Are you all right?" she asked. Because Cecily was standing in the cold in a thin dress telling the truth about her own engagement, which required a specific quality of courage that deserved acknowledgement. Cecily blinked. Apparently this was not the response she had expected. She stopped. "I'm cold," she said, "and I'm tired of pretending things are other than they are. Apart from that, I think I'm all right." "Go inside," Evelyn said gently. "Warm up." Cecily moved toward the door, stopped. "Miss Ashworth." She turned back, one hand on the door. "What he did was wrong. How he did it was wrong. He should have told you. He should have asked." Her voice was quiet and very steady. "But I think he did it because he didn't know what else to do, and the thing he couldn't bear was the thought of your life being diminished." She paused. "That doesn't excuse it, but it's not nothing either." She went inside. Evelyn stood alone on the terrace in the cold. The waltz continued behind the glass. The garden was dark and still. The spring bulbs pushed upward in the dark earth, pale and determined and entirely indifferent to the difficulty of what they were doing. She stayed there for a long time. She was not, she realized, angry in the way she had expected to be angry. She was angry, she was quite thoroughly angry, with a clarity and a completeness that she thought would probably need to be expressed at some point and soon. He had made every decision. He had decided what she needed and what she didn't and what she could bear and what she couldn't, and he had been wrong about most of it, and he had not asked. But underneath the anger, further down, past the exhaustion and the grief and the cold and the long, difficult week, there was something else. Something that had been there in October, in the library, in the low firelight. Something she had folded away in a box under her bed for 11 years. She picked up her champagne. She went inside. The letter arrived at Manor on a Wednesday morning. James had read it 4 times. He had read it the first time standing at his writing desk still in his writing clothes, having taken it from the Morning Post with the particular alertness of a man who has been waiting for something without admitting to himself that he was waiting. He had read it the second time sitting down. The third time he had walked to the window and read it with the paper held slightly lower than necessary, as though the light were better there, which it was not. The fourth time he had simply stood in the middle of the room and read it, and then stood there after he had finished, holding it. I have spent 11 years saying the right things and putting the true things in a box under my bed, and I find I am no longer entirely willing to do that. He had put the letter in the inside pocket of his coat. He had gone to the Pemberton ball. He had seen her at the top of those 3 steps in a dark burgundy dress with her mother's earrings and her chin level, and her eyes moving quietly through the room with the specific composure of a woman who has decided something and is not going to be moved from it. And something in his chest had done something he declined to examine too closely. And then she had looked at him across the crowded ballroom and said, in a voice of perfect correctness, "Thank you for attending my father's funeral," and walked away. He had stood there for a moment after she left. Then he had gone home, dismissed his valet, sat in the chair by the fire, and had what might charitably be described as a serious conversation with himself. The serious conversation had lasted most of the night, and had covered considerable ground. It had covered the evening at Houseworth, which he had been turning over since October with the persistent, unwilling attention of a man who knows he is thinking about something he has decided not to think about and cannot seem to stop. It had covered the letter he had received, and the particular phrasing of it, without once asking, was not in the letter. Evelyn had not written those words, but somehow they were in it anyway, present in the spaces between the sentences, and he had felt them. It had covered the arrangement with Lord Hargrove, which he had made in the specific urgency of a man who had learned something alarming, and had acted on the first available solution without sufficient examination of whether the solution was actually good. He had believed when he made it that he was being decisive, practical, that he was protecting someone who needed protecting, and that this was straightforwardly the right thing to do. He understood now, sitting in the chair at 2 in the morning with the fire burning low, that he had also been doing something else, something less straightforward. He had been removing himself from an impossible situation by making the removal appear necessary. He had given himself a reason, a genuine reason, a serious one. He was not pretending the threat to Evelyn's reputation had been invented, but he had also, if he was being honest, welcomed the reason, because the alternative was to stay, to say the thing he had been not saying since Houseworth, to ask Evelyn what she wanted and then actually wait for the answer. And he had been, he understood now, afraid of the answer. Not because he thought she would refuse him. He had thought about it enough to have formed a view on that, which he was not going to examine at 2 in the morning, because of what it would mean if she didn't, because of what it would cost her, the title, the obligations, the weight of his family's expectations, the specific and unrelenting demands of a life lived at the center of everyone's attention. Because she was someone who read widely and thought carefully and managed impossible things with quiet competence and deserved, he had concluded, a life that was actually her own. He had decided this on her behalf. He had not asked her. He had heard Evelyn's voice in his memory, saying something she had said to him once about a mutual acquaintance who had made a series of significant decisions for his wife without consulting her. I imagine she found it very tidy. Other people's certainty always is. He had, at the time, agreed with her. He sat with that for a while. In the morning he sent for his solicitor. Not for the reasons the solicitor assumed. The man arrived with a cautiously optimistic expression, and a folder of papers related to the Hargrove settlement, which James set aside immediately. "I need to know," James said, "the precise nature of the documents Lord Hargrove claims to hold, not the summary he gave me 6 weeks ago, the actual documents, their origin, their content, and most importantly, whether they would withstand scrutiny." The solicitor looked at him carefully. "Your Grace." "I should have asked these questions 6 weeks ago," James said. "I am asking them now." What the solicitor told him over the following 2 hours rearranged several things James had believed to be fixed. Lord Hargrove had presented the situation 6 weeks ago with the confidence of a man holding strong cards. There were documents, he had said, linking Sir Edmund Ashworth to a business venture that had collapsed under circumstances that could generously be described as irregular. If these came to light, the Ashworth name would be damaged. Miss Ashworth's prospects, already limited, would be destroyed entirely. James had believed him. He had acted on the belief. He had not, in the urgency of the moment, done what he always did in every other area of his life, which was to examine the claim from every angle before accepting it as true. The solicitor, who had spent the last week quietly investigating at James's request, following a vague unease that had been growing since the Pemberton ball, had found something considerably more complicated. The documents existed. That part was true. What was not true, or rather, what was considerably less simple than presented, was their significance. Sir Edmund had been associated with the venture. He had invested in it and the venture had failed. But the irregularities, the part that could be made to look damaging, were not Sir Edmund's doing. They were another party's. And the documents, examined properly rather than in the selective summary Lord Hargrove had provided, made this reasonably clear. They could have been used against the Ashworth name. With the right presentation, the right emphasis, the right audience, they could have been made to look precisely as damaging as Lord Hargrove had suggested. But they would not have survived serious scrutiny. A competent solicitor, or a determined woman, James thought, with a specific and unwilling admiration, could have dismantled the case entirely. Lord Hargrove had gambled on James not looking too closely. He had been right. James sat for a long time after the solicitor left. He sat and he thought about Evelyn standing at her father's grave in a dress, let out at the seams, because there had been no time for a proper fitting. He thought about her walking away from him at the Pemberton ball with the precise, quiet correctness of someone who has run out of patience and has decided not to make a scene about it. He thought about the letter. I would rather know the truth of it than spend another year pretending, and understood, with a completeness he found genuinely uncomfortable, how badly he had managed this. He had acted to protect her from a threat that was considerably less solid than he had been led to believe. He had not verified the threat. He had not told Evelyn. He had made, on her behalf and without her knowledge, a decision that had cost them both something significant, and he had done it while believing himself to be acting correctly, to be doing the right thing. The worst part, he thought, was not the mistake itself. Mistakes were made. Information was incomplete. People acted on what they knew and were wrong. The worst part was that he had not asked her. He had constructed an entire architecture of protection around her, careful, thorough, expensive, and had never once said, "Evelyn, there is something happening. What do you want to do?" He knew what she would have said. He knew, because he knew her, that she would have been furious and clear-eyed and would have identified the weakness in Lord Hargrove's position approximately 40 minutes after being told about it. He knew she would have managed it. She managed everything. He had not asked because some part of him had believed, had needed to believe, that the situation required him to act alone. That protecting her required his absence. That the kindest thing he could do was to remove himself cleanly and give her the freedom of not being attached to him. He had told himself this was about her. He understood now that it had also been about him, about the specific terror of staying, of saying the unsaid thing and waiting for the answer and not being able to control what came next. It was, he thought, the least flattering possible conclusion about his own behavior. He put his hands on the desk. He looked at the letter in front of him, Evelyn's letter, which he had been carrying in his coat pocket since Wednesday and had taken out and placed on the desk sometime in the last hour without fully noticing. He'd done it. "I have questions, not accusations, questions. If you are the man I believe you to be, you will answer them honestly." He picked up his pen. He began to write. He stopped after 3 sentences. Not because the words were wrong, they were adequate, they were honest, they said what needed saying, but because they were words on paper, because he had spent 11 years in a particular relationship with Evelyn that had been conducted largely through proximity and conversation, and the specific, insufficient communication of 2 people who understood each other very well and had never once said the most important things. He did not want to write another letter. He put down the pen. He called for his horse. He arrived at Ashworth just after noon. The house looked, he thought, very quiet. Not the quiet of a comfortable afternoon, but the quiet of a place that had lost its organizing presence and had not yet found a new one, the particular stillness of a house in transition, neither what it had been nor what it was going to become. Mrs. Beale answered the door with an expression that managed to be welcoming, guarded, and extremely attentive to detail simultaneously. "Is Miss Ashworth at home?" he asked, a pause. "She is in the garden, Your Grace." He found her at the far end of the kitchen garden, which was not where he had expected to find her, and was in retrospect exactly where he should have. She was in a plain gray dress with her sleeves rolled to the elbows and her hair coming slightly loose from its pins, kneeling beside a raised bed with a trowel in her hand, and a focused expression that suggested she had been doing this for some time, and found it considerably more straightforward than most things currently happening in her life. She heard him approach. He knew she heard him. He saw the slight adjustment in her shoulders, the deliberate continuation of what she was doing for 3 or 4 seconds before she looked up. She looked up. Her eyes were very clear. Whatever she was feeling, and he had some sense of what she was feeling, she was not going to make this easy for him. He was glad of it. He stopped a few feet away. He stood in the thin spring sunlight with his hat in his hands and looked at her kneeling in the garden, and understood that he had arrived at the moment that everything before it had been, in one way or another, postponing. He said, "I owe you a considerable explanation." Evelyn sat back on her heels. She set the trowel down carefully. She looked at him with the expression he knew best, steady, patient, giving away nothing, waiting. "Yes," she said, "you do." He opened his mouth. She said, "But before you give it," she looked at him directly, with a precision that he felt somewhere behind his sternum. "I have one question, and I want you to answer it before you explain anything, before you tell me your reasons or your intentions or what you were trying to protect me from." He waited. "Did you," she said, "at any point consider asking me what I wanted?" The garden was very quiet. A bird moved in the hedgerow. The spring air was cold and clean and utterly indifferent. James Calloway, Duke of Marath, stood in the thin sunlight with his hat in his hands and looked at the woman kneeling in the garden and told her the truth. "No," he said, "I didn't." The silence that followed was the most honest thing that had passed between them in 11 years. The silence lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. James did not try to fill it. This, Evelyn thought, was either a sign of genuine contrition or very good instincts, possibly both. With James it was frequently both. She looked at him standing there in the kitchen garden with his hat in his hands and the spring light falling across his face and the particular expression of a man who has said something true and is waiting to find out what it costs him. She had imagined this moment, not deliberately, not with any intention, but the way you imagine things you have been trying not to think about, in the unguarded minutes before sleep or the distracted intervals between tasks. She had imagined being angrier. She was angry. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. The anger was present and it was legitimate, and it was not going anywhere simply because he was standing in her garden looking like a man who understood, finally, the full dimensions of what he had done. 11 years, 3 months of silence, a funeral, an announcement made in a churchyard over her father's fresh grave in front of everyone who had ever known her name. She was angry. She was also, underneath the anger, something else. Something that had been there since Cecily's voice on the terrace. He did it because he didn't know what else to do, and the thing he couldn't bear was the thought of your life being diminished. Something that had been there, if she was honest, since October. Since a library and a low fire and 4 seconds of looking at each other without pretending to be looking somewhere else. She picked up her trowel, set it down again, stood up because she was not going to have this conversation on her knees. "Tell me," she said, "all of it from the beginning," he told her. He told it plainly, without embellishment, without the careful management she might have expected, simply the sequence of events in the order they had happened. Beginning with the evening he had received the information about her father's documents, and ending with the solicitor's findings that morning. He did not soften the parts that reflected badly on him. He did not reach, she noticed, for the ready explanations, the urgency, the good intentions, the impossibility of the situation. He simply described what he had done and what he had failed to do and left the interpretation to her. She listened without interrupting. It took some time. The spring air moved through the garden around them. Somewhere in the house, she could hear the distant domestic sounds of Mrs. Beale's afternoon, a door, a kettle, the specific rhythm of someone else's ordinary day continuing its ordinary business entirely unaware of what was happening in the kitchen garden. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The documents," she said. "You believe the solicitor is right, that they would not have survived scrutiny?" "Yes. You could have told me. 6 weeks ago, when you first learned about them, you could have come to me and told me." "Yes. I would have managed it." "I know." "You knew then too." A pause. "Yes," she looked at him. "Then why?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer, might retreat into the managed silence she knew so well, the careful non-response of a man who has decided that some things are better left unexamined. She was already preparing herself for the frustration of it when he spoke. "Because I was afraid," he said. The simplicity of it stopped her. "Not of Lord Hargrove," he continued. His voice was level, but she could hear the effort underneath it, the specific effort of a man saying something he would prefer, very much, not to say. "Not of the documents, of what came after. If I had come to you, if we had managed it together and it was resolved and there was nothing standing between the situation and—" He stopped. "I told myself I was protecting you. I believe I was also protecting myself from having to find out whether what I thought was between us was real, or whether I had constructed it out of 11 years of wanting it to be." The kitchen garden was very quiet. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. "That," she said, "is the most honest thing you have ever said to me." Something moved in his face. "It is also," she continued, "the most infuriating, because you have just described doing the wrong thing for a reason I find entirely understandable, which makes it considerably harder to be as angry as I would like to be." "I'm sorry," he said, and then, because apparently he had committed to honesty and was going to see it through, "I'm sorry for the churchyard. There is no explanation for that. There is a reason and it is insufficient, and I am sorry." She had not expected the churchyard. She had expected him to explain the arrangement, the documents, the engagement. She had not expected him to name the thing that had actually cost her the most. Something tightened in her chest and then, slowly, loosened. "Why," she said, "the churchyard? Why then, why there, why like that?" He looked at the ground briefly, then back at her. "Because I thought if I did it publicly, in a situation where you couldn't respond, where the occasion required composure, I thought it would be cleaner. That if I made it final and public and unavoidable, I would stop." He stopped. "Stop what?" "Stop reconsidering," he said quietly. "I had been reconsidering every day for 3 weeks." She thought about standing at the grave's edge with her hands pressed together inside her black gloves. She thought about watching him leave the churchyard with a nod from 20 feet, the nod you give an acquaintance, someone you know only slightly. She thought about what it had cost her to stand there and show nothing. "I was very angry," she said. "In the churchyard. I want you to know that. I was angrier than I have ever been in my life, and I could not show it, and that made it worse. I know." His voice was very quiet. I watched you stand there, and I knew what I was doing to you. I told myself it was necessary. I told myself it was the right thing." A pause. "I knew it wasn't." They stood in the kitchen garden in the thin spring sunlight. Not close enough to touch. Far enough apart that the distance was a choice, not an accident. Between them, the turned earth of the raised beds and the first green things pushing up through the dark soil, and 11 years of almost things that had been folded carefully away and were now, whether either of them had planned it, sitting in the open air. Evelyn thought about what Cecily had said. What he did was wrong. How he did it was wrong. But I think he did it because he didn't know what else to do. She thought about her father's letter. The choice of what to do with it is yours. She thought about the box under her bed and 11 years of true things folded into it, and the one letter she had finally sent, and the particular relief of it, the quietness it had produced, even in the worst week of her life. She thought about what she wanted. Not what was sensible, not what the county would think, not what was practical or careful or likely to preserve her from further risk. What she actually wanted, if the world were organized in a way that permitted wanting things. She knew the answer. She had known it for 11 years. She had written it down in various forms in a box under her bed, and it had not changed. But knowing what she wanted and deciding what to do with it were not the same thing. And she was not. She had decided sometime between the terrace at Pemberton and the kitchen garden this morning, going to let this moment be another almost moment. Was not going to fold it away and be sensible and find out in another 11 years what it had cost her. She looked at James. "The engagement," she said. "Cecily." "I spoke to Lord Hargrove this morning," he said, "before I came here. The arrangement is based on a misrepresentation, and I have told him so. The engagement will be dissolved." "Does Cecily know?" "Not yet. I intend to speak to her today. I believe," a small pause, "I believe she will not be entirely devastated." Evelyn thought about Cecily on the terrace in the cold, pale green dress, and her two younger sisters, and her honest, inconvenient integrity. "I would not stand in the way of something real." "She deserves better than a financial arrangement," Evelyn said. "Yes," James agreed. "She does, a bit." "So do you," he said quietly. She looked at him. He was watching her with the expression from the library at Houseworth, the one she had spent 4 months trying to explain away and could not. The one that was not a question and not a declaration, but something that lived in the space between them, had always lived there, and was now simply declining to pretend otherwise. "I have a list," she said, "of things you did wrong. It is not a short list." "I expected it wouldn't be." "I intend to go through it with you." "I know. At some length." "I understand." "And you are going to listen to all of it," she said, "without explaining or justifying or doing that thing you do where you agree with a point in a way that technically concedes it, but makes me feel I've been somehow managed." Something that was almost a smile. "That is a very accurate description of something I do." "I know exactly what you do," she said. "I have been watching you do it for 11 years. The almost smile became something more complete, something she had seen rarely enough that it still did what it had always done, moved through her chest like something settling into place. "Evelyn," he said. "Don't," she said, not unkindly. "Not yet. You owe me the list first." He looked at her. She looked back. The spring air moved through the kitchen garden, and the first green things pushed upward in the dark soil, and somewhere in the house, Mrs. Beale's kettle came to a boil and was attended to. "Then," he said, "may I at least come inside?" She considered him for a moment. Then she bent down, picked up her trowel, and turned toward the house. "You may," she said over her shoulder. "Wipe your boots." He followed her. The list took the better part of 2 hours. She had not, in fact, written it down, but she found, once she began, that she did not need to. It was all there in the order it had happened, clear and complete and waiting to be said. The 3 months of silence, the churchyard, the decision made on her behalf without her knowledge. The money offered to her father. You tried to purchase my freedom without asking whether I wanted to be purchased, which produced the longest silence of the afternoon, and also, when he finally responded to it, the most honest thing she had heard from him outside the kitchen garden. He listened. He did not explain or justify or do the thing she had described, which she suspected cost him considerably more effort than he showed. When she finished, he said what needed saying, not at length, not with embellishment. Simply and directly, in the manner of a man who has done something wrong and is not going to pretend it was right. Then she was quiet. Then he said, "May I say one thing?" "One," she said. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since approximately the 2nd year of our acquaintance. Everything I did badly. But it was not, none of it was indifference." The fire was burning in the small sitting room where Mrs. Beale had installed them with tea they had actually drunk this time. The afternoon light was moving toward evening. Outside the window, the kitchen garden was just visible, the turned earth darkening as the light went. Evelyn looked at the fire for a moment. "I know," she said, a pause. "I know," she said again, more quietly. That was the most infuriating part. She did not forgive him all at once. She wanted to be clear about that, to herself primarily, because she had a long history of being her own least reliable narrator when it came to James Calloway, and she intended to be careful. She did not forgive him all at once because some things required time and some wounds required proper attention before they healed correctly. And she had spent 11 years being very sensible, and she was going to continue being sensible even now, when sensible looked like sitting by a fire in the late afternoon and talking honestly to a man who had finally, after a very long time, said the true things instead of the correct ones. But when he left, when he stood at the door in the early evening light with his hat in his hands and asked, very carefully, whether he might call again, she said yes. Not because she had forgiven everything, not because the list was completed and the account settled and the 11 years neatly resolved. Because he had come, he had told the truth. He had listened to the full list without once doing the thing she had described. And because when she had said, at the end of 2 hours, "You should have asked me," he had looked at her and said simply, "I know, I'm asking now." She had not answered that yet. She was going to make him wait a little for the answer. This was, she felt, entirely reasonable. She stood at the door and watched his horse disappear down the lane, and then she went back inside and stood in the small sitting room with the dying fire, and the teacups, and the particular atmosphere of a room where something significant has just happened. She thought about the box under her bed. She went upstairs. She took the box out. She sat on the edge of the bed with it in her lap, not opening it, simply holding it. 11 years. Every true thing she had not said, folded and placed and preserved with the specific care of someone who was not ready to throw them away but could not bear to let them out. She thought, "I don't need to write it down this time." She put the box back. She went to the window and looked out at the lane, which was empty now, the last of the evening light moving golden across the fields toward Marath. She was not finished being angry. She was not finished requiring things of him. She had a great deal of work ahead, the solicitor, the accounts, the house, the long, slow business of setting a life in order after it had been disrupted. But somewhere underneath all of it, past the anger and the grief and the exhaustion and the enormous amount of remaining practical difficulty, something was quiet, something that had been waiting for a very long time. She let it be quiet. The morning began, as most mornings did at Marath, with more correspondence than any reasonable person should have to manage before breakfast. Evelyn managed it anyway. She was at the writing desk in the east sitting room, her sitting room now, arranged to her preferences, which meant books on every available surface, and a window kept slightly open regardless of the temperature, and a second chair pulled close to the fire for no reason except that she liked having it there. The Morning Post was sorted into 3 piles: estate business, personal correspondence, and the category she had privately labeled things James will want to discuss at length and is already forming opinions about. This third pile was not small. She was halfway through the estate business when she heard him in the corridor, that particular quality of footstep, which she had memorized without intending to and would apparently continue to recognize with unfailing accuracy for the remainder of her life. She heard him stop outside the door. A brief pause. Then a knock, which he had developed the habit of doing despite the fact that it was, technically, his sitting room too, because she had mentioned once in the early months that she liked the courtesy of it. He had not forgotten. "Come in," she said. He came in with 2 cups of coffee, which meant he had intercepted the tray in the corridor and carried it himself, which meant he had been up for a while and was in the particular mood that expressed itself through small domestic gestures. She had learned to read his moods the way she read weather, not by any single sign, but by the accumulation of small details into a reliable picture. She took the coffee. He took the chair by the fire, the second chair, the one she had put there for no reason, and picked up the newspaper and then set it down again without reading it, which meant he wanted to talk. "The Hargrove letter," she said, without looking up from the correspondence. "Second pile," a pause. "You've already read it." "It arrived yesterday. You were in the North Field." He retrieved it from the second pile. She watched him read it from the corner of her eye, the slight shift in his expression, the small nod that meant the contents were satisfactory. "She seems well," he said. "She is well. She writes that Mr. Ashford is extremely attentive and that her mother is pretending to have had reservations about him all along, which Cecily finds amusing." A brief sound that was almost a laugh. "She would." Evelyn set down her pen, picked up her coffee. "I told you she would be all right." "You did." "In some detail." "Also accurate." He looked at her over the letter with the expression she had come to know best of all, the one that was not quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood, warm and unhurried and entirely unguarded in the way that still, occasionally, caught her off balance. "You generally are." "I know," she said. "You should factor that into your decision-making more consistently." "I am working on it." She returned to the correspondence. They had been married 11 months. The wedding had been in April, in the same church at St. Bride's where her father was buried. This had been her choice, and James had understood immediately why without her needing to explain it, had simply said of course and made no further comment, which was exactly the right response, and which she had noted in the running internal account she kept of things he was getting better at. The account had grown considerably over the past year. He still had a tendency to make decisions without consulting her on matters he considered straightforwardly practical, which they had discussed 3 times and would probably discuss again. He still carried things quietly when he should put them down and ask for help. He still occasionally retreated into the managed silence when something was difficult, though she had developed a reliable method for extracting him from it, which she declined to tell him about on the grounds that a method stops working once the subject is aware of it. He listened. He was, she had discovered, extraordinarily good at listening when he had decided to do it properly. Not the performative attention of a man waiting for his turn to speak, but the actual thing, the kind that changed his mind sometimes and always, at minimum, made her feel that she had been genuinely heard. He had gone through the list with her, all of it, more than once in the early months because some things needed more than one conversation, and she was not interested in resolving things incorrectly simply because revisiting them was uncomfortable. He had not once, in any of those conversations, done the thing she had described in the kitchen garden. She had told him about the box. Not immediately. In the autumn, sitting by the fire one evening when the conversation had reached the particular depth it sometimes reached, she had told him about it, the letters, the 11 years, the true things folded away. He had been quiet for a long moment. Then he had said, "How many?" "I didn't count them." Another pause. "Would you?" He stopped. "You don't have to, but I would very much like to read them, if you would let me." She had thought about it for a week. Then she had given him the box. She had left him alone with it and gone to the garden, and stayed there for an hour because she could not watch him read them and maintain anything resembling composure. When she came back, he was sitting in the chair with the box closed on the table beside him, and an expression she had never seen on his face before, something open and a little undone. The expression of a man who has just been shown something of great value and is understanding fully what it cost the person who kept it. He had not said anything for a long time. Then, "Evelyn." "Don't," she had said. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to." His voice was very quiet. "I want to," she had let him. She had, she discovered, been waiting longer than she knew for someone to want to. The east sitting room in late spring was a very pleasant room. The window was open its customary inch and a half, and the air coming through it carried the smell of the kitchen garden below, turned earth and the first herbs and something green and clean that belonged entirely to this particular morning in this particular year. The fire had burned down to comfortable coals. The second pile of correspondence was not going to manage itself. Evelyn finished her coffee. "The Pemberton invitation," she said. "It's in the third pile. Lady Pemberton has added a personal note at the bottom asking whether the East Wing renovation is complete and whether we will be prepared to host the winter party this year." James lowered the newspaper he had finally opened. "What do you think?" "I think the East Wing will be complete by October if the builders stop finding reasons to revisit decisions we've already made." She picked up her pen. "I think Lady Pemberton is a force of nature who will organize the winter party herself if we don't offer, and that having her organize it in our house without our involvement would be significantly more alarming than simply agreeing." "Agreed." He paused. "Also, the winter party is where you wore the burgundy dress last year." She looked up. He was not looking at the newspaper. "You remember what I was wearing," she said. "I remember everything about that evening, including the part where I walked away from you. Especially that part," the almost smile. "It was the moment I understood that I had managed to make a serious error with someone who was not going to wait indefinitely for me to correct it." "I wasn't going to wait indefinitely," she agreed. "I had waited quite long enough. 11 years. Give or take." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm sorry for all of it. I know I've said it. I'll keep saying it as long as it needs saying." "It doesn't need saying every day anymore," she said. "For the record." "No." "No," she returned to the correspondence. "It needs saying occasionally, when the occasion warrants it." A brief pause. "This was a warranted occasion, you may note it." She heard him make the sound that was not quite a laugh, and was better. An hour later the correspondence was done, and the third pile had been sorted into yes, no, and requires further discussion, and the spring air was coming through the window, and the coals had gone gray and comfortable in the grate. James had fallen asleep in the second chair, which happened sometimes on slow mornings. He was an early riser and paid for it by the time the correspondence was finished. He was asleep with the newspaper across his knee, and his head tipped back and his expression, in sleep entirely unmanaged, none of the careful composure, none of the weight of the title and the obligations and the specific demands of his name. Simply a man asleep in a chair by a fire. Evelyn looked at him for a moment. She thought about the churchyard, about standing at the grave's edge with her hands pressed together inside her black gloves, her knuckles white, every person in the county watching for her to break, about the particular quality of that silence and everything it had contained. She thought about the kitchen garden, about going through the list, 2 hours, all of it. About the fire burning down in the small sitting room and the evening light moving golden across the fields. She thought about the box under the bed, which was still there. She had put it back after. Not because she needed it anymore, not in the same way, but because it was 11 years of her own true thoughts, and she was not, in the end, going to throw them away. She looked at James asleep in the second chair, the chair she had placed there for no reason except that she liked having it there. She thought, there it is. She turned back to the window. The kitchen garden was bright in the morning light below, the herbs coming up green and determined. The raised beds she had tended through the worst week of her life now tended by 3 people instead of 1. The lane beyond the garden was empty. The fields beyond the lane stretched toward the village, toward St. Bride's, toward the small stone where her father's name was carved. She thought about what her father had written. The choice of what to do with it is yours. She had chosen. She had chosen badly for a long time, in the specific way of a person who has been told to be sensible for so long that she has stopped distinguishing between sensible and small. She had folded the true things away and managed the impossible things and stood very still while the world made decisions around her. And she had done all of this with a competence so complete that no one had noticed, perhaps not even herself, how much it cost. And then she had sent a letter. And then she had put on the burgundy dress. And then she had stood in a kitchen garden with dirt on her hands and said, "Did you at any point consider asking me what I wanted?" She had not cried in the churchyard. She had cried twice in the year since, once in the early autumn alone for her father, properly and at length and on the floor of the east corridor where no one came. Once on the morning of her wedding, which she had not anticipated and which had arrived without warning while she was pinning her hair. A sudden and complete and entirely different kind of grief and relief together, as though something that had been held for a very long time had finally, at the specific moment it was no longer needed, let go. She did not think of herself as someone who cried easily. But standing at the window in the spring morning with the garden below and the coals gray in the grate and James asleep in the second chair, the chair she had placed there for no reason, except that she liked having it there, except that it was for him, had always been for him. Even before she admitted it, she felt something loosen in her chest. Quiet and certain and long overdue. She did not cry. She smiled. She picked up her pen and began the next letter. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. If you enjoyed one of our stories, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can join as a member or send a super thanks or super chat. Your support helps us continue creating more stories like this. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories.